Okay, so our next keynote is by Dr. Safiya Noble. Dr. Noble is an associate professor at UCLA in the departments of Studies and African American Studies. You might know her as the author of a best-selling book on racist and sexist algorithmic bias in commercial search engines that was entitled Algorithms of Impression: How Search Engines Reinforce Racism. She has a PhD and MS in Library and Information Sciences from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, so I'm a little bit partial to her. Her academic research focuses on the design of digital media platforms on the internet and their impact on society. Her work is both sociological and interdisciplinary, marking the ways that digital media impacts and intersects with issues of race, gender, culture, and technology. As you know, our cyberlearning research by definition is interdisciplinary. It brings together both innovations in the learning sciences and in computer science. And Dr. Noble wants us to also make more central in our work the humanities and other types of social sciences that explore how technologies impact humans in different ways. Her talk today, if we can get up on the machine, is entitled The Problems and Perils of Harnessing Big Data for Equity and Justice. And we're restarting, so that's fun. It's all good.
I have a couple jokes that I've workshopped and I'm gonna fill in. It's not ready yet, and we'll do it. Yeah, it's not you, it's me. I've only said that a couple times in my life. All right.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that lovely introduction. Right as I was walking up, my computer crashed, like it does. So I will take a minute to tell you a little bit about myself, and maybe I can just get like a grace period of 2 minutes or something at the end. I am really excited to be here. I was over at the Smithsonian this morning, and there are a lot of people there gathered also talking about similar sets of concerns, mostly having to do with things like digitization of knowledge. I come from the field of library and information science, so in that field, it's always interesting to be among scholars, listening to people talking about knowledge and education and information, and the way we talk about it in our field in LIS is quite different because, of course, we're feeling so many dimensions of the threats of misinformation and disinformation that are really all around us. And so some of the things I was so interested in the previous speaker, Mike, in your talk, because these concerns about kind of data and the making of data and the access to data and information appears as if all data and all information are equal or stable or reliable. And of course, if I get a talk together here, I'm gonna maybe generate some provocations around that except Apple says, sorry, can't read that PowerPoint. So we'll see what happens here. I wrote a book called Algorithms of Oppression, and in it I was really interested in the ways in which I had spent 15 years in advertising and marketing before going to grad school. And as I was going back to graduate school, mostly to atone for my sins from having sold like booze and cars and stuff like that when I worked in advertising, and so that's what that was about. It was interesting to me that it was a moment when we were in the height of the Google book digitization project, which some of you might remember. And I know some of you are also like, sorry, we did that because, that was happening. And everyone was talking about Google like it was the new public library. And that was interesting to me because as I was leaving advertising, we were hiring so many freelance programmers to come in and help us game the system and game search to bolster the visibility of our clients' products and services. And no one thought for 1 second in advertising that Google search was the public library. It was an advertising platform as far as we were concerned. And I think also as far as Google was concerned. So it wasn't even a mystery. And so it was interesting to kind of enter that juxtaposition where everyone was, engaging with Google as if we were, that's my sign for I'm ready, engaging as if the new kind of commercial digital technologies were going to be some type of, did you see how I did that? I mean, I amazed myself that I kept that going and got that up. No, it's fine. It's just funny to me, and just please don't tweet my mess out. But it was amazing to me that people were so just enamored with search in particular. So a lot of my work is focused on search because I find that people use it as kind of their first pass or first go-to when they're trying to learn about something. And of course, this is incredibly dangerous, and I'm going to talk to you about why this is dangerous as in the short time that we have today. And then also think about, I want to also kind of think about, so I'm going to show you some failures of what happens when we're hyper-reliant upon, big data-driven platforms that are of a commercial nature in particular. And then also think about how so many of these kinds of impulses are getting replicated into educational technology and learning technology spaces, and see if we might imagine some other possibilities. Now, it was funny when I was writing, and by funny I mean terrible, when I was writing my dissertation and I was looking for 4 people who would be on a dissertation committee because I wanted to argue that algorithms were biased at the kind of core level of code, but also that technologies were not tools, that they were more than tools, that they were also a set of values, and that they were political. And it was very difficult back in 2010, 11, 12, when I was working on the dissertation, to find 4 people who would put their name to such a dissertation. And yet here we are now, everyone is like the biased algorithms. And I'm like, are they? Because remember when I was saying that a minute ago and everyone said, no, that's impossible because it's just math and math can't be racist? See, we've come a long way, baby. Do you know what I mean? And I'm very happy about that because once we start to create kind of new normals, we get to have different conversations. And I think that is a very exciting moment that we're in, that we are in a position to finally really mainstream critique of various types of digital technologies. And that means that we can do something different, better, alternate. Now, you might remember that for like the 3 people in here who are familiar with my work, the first study that I did was looking for different types of identities in search. And I was, and this is important just kind of just to get us all on the same page about the implications of big data-based technologies. When in 2000, starting in about 2009, all the way through 2012, I was collecting searches on all kinds of identities: Black girls, African American girls, women. I basically used the census categories and I paired them with a set of gendered categories: boy, girl, men, women, man, woman, and so forth. And I did an analysis to see how are people represented in these spaces. And one of the things that was so disturbing was to see that Black girls in particular, as well as Latina girls and Asian girls, were hypersexualized and almost exclusively represented by pornography. Now, how can this be? People would say things to me like, well, you know, this just reflects what the public wants, what's out there. This search engines, it's not Google's fault. Search is just a reflection of the public and how the public thinks. And I was like, nope, that's not it. That's an insufficient explanation, because if that's the case, then any community that is in the majority will get to control the narrative about everybody else forever. So we can't really rest on that this is just a matter of that. Also, let me tell you that girls in this context is women, because the subjects and the agents that are a part of the porn industry are grown women. So where do the girls, where do the children, where do the vulnerable get to be represented? Oh, they get to be, I mean, this is like, in my gender studies class, this would be like a sexism 101. Like, women get coded as girls. Go, fix, right? I mean, solve. So these are some, kind of assumptions that are made about the characterization, the classification of information about people. And I collected a lot of information and data and evidence about how these kinds of processes happen over and over and over again, and that's in a book. For years I was talking about this, and people would say, one of the things I also try to parse is kind of the commercial, kind of political economy of search engines, that industries that have the most money also win in these. So vulnerable communities, adolescents are never going to be able to compete with the kind of money that, let's say, the porn industry has. And of course, a lot has changed since 2012. Certainly, large commercial platforms are doing a lot more to try to manage the types of content that move through their work, and also the criticisms have engendered and kind of forced a lot of different kinds of review. People always felt really sad when I would give this talk years ago, about this specific research. And then the same kinds of logics of misrepresenting people and information and ideas, let's say through a presidential election. And now people are really interested in talking about the way in which algorithms work and inform the public. Here's another quick search. This was a tweet, in fact, that went viral about when you did a search on something like professional hairstyles for work. I can imagine any one of my undergraduates getting ready to go on the job market, looking for professional hairstyles for work. When you did unprofessional hairstyles for work, you were given almost exclusively Black women with natural hair. So I like to wear my unprofessional hairstyle to work, which I'm doing right now, and it's actually the hairstyle I wear every day. And then when you look for professional hairstyles for women, you would get almost exclusively white women with updos and ponytails. And so for my white sisters, it's really the updo and the ponytail that makes you professional, apparently. And also being white helps. So these are the kinds of things that I think people were not paying attention to, quite frankly, or they were just kind of in spotty ways noticing. And so I tried to amass all of the kind of evidence that I could find into this book. Now here's a more sophisticated and nuanced type of phenomena that happens online, which is when white nationalists take over a very specific kind of disciplinary logic and want to reframe it. So here you have Boasian anthropology. And for the, I think, 2 Boasian anthropologists that I've ever met in my life who understood the politics of what this meant, it's really important, right? Because there are a number of ways in which ideas about people and communities get hijacked and put in service, again, of things like Holocaust denying, anti-Semitism, and blatant kinds of white supremacy. And not that unprofessional hairstyles for work isn't also a manifestation of kind of racist ideologies, but you also have coordinated efforts to destabilize different types of knowledge bases. And again, I think this is incredibly important that we not take for granted the sources of knowledge that one might be drawing upon as they are developing all kinds of different learning models and sources and resources that they're using. So here we are, we're at a moment in time where we are experiencing what the Financial Times in 2018 declared as the word of the year, techlash. And part of this stems from Cambridge Analytica, kind of the breaking news of Cambridge Analytica, data mining and harvesting and brokering and selling data about us to persuade us in all kinds of various political inclinations. And of course, for other industries, people who work, again, in advertising, the whole paradigm is based on buying and selling and trading our data. I mean, it's like Cambridge Analytica is just one but thousands, one of thousands of companies that are harvesting information about us, trading and selling it, and making data profiles about us. I was in a conference a couple of years ago with the director of the FBI. Don't ask why, it was weird to me too, and how we ended up in the same spot. And he said, as far as the state was concerned, as far as the government was concerned, who we are, who you are, is your data profile. And I wonder how many of us even know what our data profile is. Who are we in the context of large-scale systems that are somewhat interoperable, but also in other ways not, that are collecting and amassing a sense of who it thinks you are? I will tell you that after years and years of doing searches on various types of identities, being a speaker and a writer about kind of racist and sexist bias in search, I didn't ever stop getting the porn sites when I was looking for Black girls until they were finally removed. So this level of customization and personalization also that we think is happening to really accurately hone in on who we are is also not true. And we've seen some really important studies out of Europe in particular where we see that the ideas about personalization are really about aggregating us. Like, you know, if I were at a library conference, I'd say, like, who's the dog people with me? And it would be like 3 people, and then everybody would be the cat people. You know, so it's like trying to figure out who are the cat people and who are the dog people and selling us to platforms. And so this is one of the other dimensions I think that we have to think about when we use machine learning and, you know, this kind of data that gets scraped about us or that we buy about students or that we're collecting on students and on various publics to somehow create predictive analytics about them. And I think that, you know, we are just beginning to see the importance of the conversations about the harms that come from predictive analytics. Of course, most of these data profiling systems are about, in fact, that type of work. Now, these are some people that I think you should know about. You like how I put myself up there, but I didn't put myself first. So that somehow makes it better to me. These are people who've been writing about the kind of consequences of many forms of technologies. People who've been writing counter narratives, if you will, about the kind of in response to the techno-utopianism or in response to the digital divide. You know, I think about Craig Watkins years ago writing about how African-American teenagers were actually the most adept at using digital technologies and were really like, you know, engaging in very sophisticated ways with tech at a time when people were labeling kids of color as digitally divided and technologically deficient, right? And so the deficit modeling that happens about people of color has really been documented and historicized differently and studied differently. And so these are some names I just want to put on your radar in terms of dipping in and thinking about a whole host of different types of technologies that you might be engaging with. And again, their broader social, political, and economic consequences for vulnerable communities. Now, a few more perils, because why not? We're on a roll. This is a talk that is best served right before the cocktail hour, so I'm hopeful you'll get a bite and move past some of these difficult conversations. All right, so my colleague Jonathan Ferner at UCLA, over a decade ago, wrote a really important piece about classification. He is a philosopher and he writes about library and knowledge classification schemes. He's really an expert in knowledge organization. And I think that when we talk about things like learning and learning science, it really has to be in relationship to knowledge and knowledge organization and the making of knowledge. So if you don't know a lot about that, I invite you to come to our conferences in the field of information studies and library and information science, because I think that there would be some good ideas to double click on there. One of the things that he says that we need, to kind of respond to these systems, and again, one of the things that people forget about search engines is that when Sergey Brin and Larry Page were working on search, they were borrowing from the LIS practices of citation analytics. And now, if you're in computer science, you might think like citation analytics, these are really great because scholars cite people that are important, and every time they cite out, that's a signal that that's kind of like legitimate. And so the whole system of like hyperlinking was really based on the logics of citation analytics. But see, if you're in the field of library and information science, you know that citation analytics, we have a deep body of work that problematizes that process and says, for example, there are some people who might get cited as their work being bogus or terrible, but they got cited. Awkward. There also might be people who have become so, their concepts have, and the ideas they've introduced have become so mainstream that they don't get cited anymore because it's just common knowledge, right? So if we talk about power and class, nobody's, citing Marx behind that, for example, right? So these are the kinds of things that I think are also, when we think about like the design logics, in the architectural logics that we use, we have to reach out into other domains and start thinking more critically about what's at stake. And so, of course, one of the things we know is that there's a tremendous amount of bias in classification systems. And I would love to someday get to talk to you about that. But I don't have enough time to go too deeply. One of the other things we know is that there's this kind of adherence to a notion of neutrality, that the classification systems or the data sets that we use are neutral. So we teach quite a bit at UCLA in our department about things. We don't just teach data science, we teach about the social construction of data. The data becomes representative of very specific, rich, thick kinds of experiences, but they get in some ways abstracted from the minutia, the details of what they are representing. And at some point, they start to get aggregated in such a way that they start to not make sense. And yet we use these models, we use these data to kind of fuel the building of our models. And I think one of the things that, that I think is just something we can't forget is that data is always a representation of something that happened in the past. It's something we've collected, it's something we've documented, it's something that we have been able to assess. And that means if we use data that's made from the past and we use it into our predictive models about how students will behave, about which of course is new technology that's coming online now, we're just predicting the past into the future. And we want to ask ourselves at what cost will that come? How much of the past do we want to see predicted into the future? Matthew Reedsma wrote a great piece about algorithmic bias in library discovery systems, and I think it's actually a cautionary tale about the mechanics. So for those of you who build systems, discovery systems and other types of interfaces into large databases, like a library database, let's say, he really carefully traces how that happens, and I would definitely recommend you take a look at his work. Tara Robertson also wrote an important piece about the digitization of a really important lesbian porn magazine that ran from 1984 to 2004 called On Our Backs, which was a magazine that was designed for a very closed, intimate community that knows each other pretty well. And then their collection was digitized and made available to anybody with a web connection, a browser, and who could find it. So what's at stake when we digitize things that are not meant for the public, too? How do we discern? All data is not available, or maybe shouldn't be subject to mass availability. And these are the kinds of things where many people have been put their careers and their livelihoods put in jeopardy. In the book, I document, for example, like a teacher, 70-year-old teacher who someone found, her, racy photos from the 50s, and she lost her job. And she's like, you guys, I'm not being racy anymore. I'm 70. It's cool. So these are the kinds of things when we start thinking about, like, what does it mean to just collect everything? Jean-Francois Blanchette writes about the social value of forgetting, that there's actually a reason why we forget. And it's why juvenile records, for example, are sealed and don't follow you into your future, so you can have a chance at a future. What happens when we use these new models that we're developing, especially in educational contexts? I shudder to think that my 18-year-old self and the nonsense papers, because quite frankly, who's writing a good paper when they're 18, would follow me into my career. The private relationship of feedback and engagement that I'm trying to have with the faculty who've taught me over the course of my career, or have taught you over the course of your career. The experimentation with ideas that you can only do in that type of exchange between you and your instructor, the person you're learning from. That being digitized and put into a system like, let's say, Turnitin, and then being maybe commercialized and sold at some point, and then maybe being data mineable. These are the kinds of real projects that are happening right now. And I think there's a lot at stake that we have not properly thought through, and I'm attempting to be a partner with you in some of those conversations. Ultimately, we like to make apps, and we like to think that some of the problems and concerns that we have are going to be solved by the tech. And I really appreciated the previous speaker's comments about that. The tech. I could have worn my shirt that says "Tech won't save us." Join a union, which I love, but sometimes I feel like I get in trouble, and I might get jumped or something when I'm at the airport, especially in San Jose, when I wear that shirt. So I just keep it low. But I will tell you, thinking about the kinds of tech overlays that we're doing on various publics, I think it's so nascent. We really have yet to see what will happen when students in 10 years, students who've documented their whole lives and for whom we have documented them and participated in building systems that document and model them. What happens when they want to run for Senate or Congress? They want to be a social worker. We are putting a lot at stake, I think, when we don't think about the ethics and the kinds of issues of justice that we're going to face through the hyper-datafication of various publics. And many publics are not in a position to even respond to or opt out of these systems. I will tell you, I break down how the Moodle works for all my students at the beginning of the quarter. And I say, so I'm going to be able to see when you tell me, yes, Professor Noble, I did the readings, I can go in and I can see that you haven't actually logged in for 16 days. So I just want you to know that I can do that. And also all of your other instructors and TAs can do that. And oh my God, the watery eyes, response, because these are the kinds of things that are not transparent, even to the students that many of us are working with and care about so deeply. Ultimately, I want us to also think about, and the kinds of places where my work is going, I'm really thinking about issues of power, intersectional power. I mean, obviously I care about things like race and gender and class and power and how they work in digital technology systems. It's very important. But the other things that we need to be thinking about is as we rush toward the hyper-datafication of everything, it has a cost. There was a great study that just came out that's buzzing around Twitter right now from the MIT Tech Review that looks at a study about how large-scale data modeling programs can emit, as you can see, as much carbon as 5 cars in their lifetime. And there's quite a bit of conversation going on about this on Twitter. So think about the kind of unbridled datafication that's happening. It is not without impact, not just on the environment. I spent quite a bit of time last summer in Accra, Ghana, looking at e-waste. Where do the devices go with the constant upgrades? What do we think we're getting? One of the things I can tell you is that we're getting huge new toxic e-waste cities, neighborhoods, communities around the world where the digital waste goes. And the estimated lifespan of people who work in those toxic waste sites, taking apart all of our devices and trying to recycle and reuse, is in the 30s. So, these things happen in places that are not in the United States for the most part. And I think we have a lot at stake. If we look at the extraction, the mineral extraction and mining industries, of course, there's incredible exploitation happening there. And so I think we are the consumers pushing for these kinds of adoptions. And I think if we're going to do that, if you're going to do that, then more knowledge needs to be put into the equation and thinking about how do we offset, how do we mitigate, how do we resolve, how do we restore these types of investments that are being made, and how do we recover what is lost and who is paying the price? How do we address who is paying the price for these things? I wrote about these with my colleague Sarah Roberts. We wrote about kind of what's at stake for students, specifically in the context of educational technologies, and I think this might be a piece that could be of interest to many of you. Again, thinking about the information communication technology infrastructures that we are building, and of course, I know we're gathered here to talk about cyber learning, and one of the challenges that I think we often face is that thinking about ethics, thinking about issues of justice are often additive, add-on at the last second, throw a word in there to say that we're doing something ethical. And I think I would implore us to rethink whether we want issues and concerns about ethics and justice and society to be additive or afterthoughts. I actually participated in a recent NSF grant, and I was invited to participate because of my expertise. And it was the grant I think was for like $300,000, and it's like a small proposal, and the ethics part was maxed out at $50K. And I was like, that is interesting in terms of like our orientation to these very real sets of concerns. And I think whether the call asks for us to address these kinds of concerns that are very specific to the context and the places where you all do your work, we don't have to wait for the call to think about these things and make them more central. We could actually just design our work with a type of care. So I want to leave you with a few things we can think about. I think we can reconsider and consider the effect of hyper-datafication in the context of the things I've shared just so briefly. I'm sorry that there isn't more time to do more. Resist making these ideas an afterthought or additive. I think we must protect vulnerable people from surveillance and data profiling. I was just interviewed for a story that I don't think has come out yet by the Chronicle of Higher Ed, where a campus is using a new geolocative type of tech where they're basically surveilling students all over the campus. How much time are they in the library? How much time are they, here, there, and everywhere on the campus? And it's been sold as a tool of helping students learn better. So you guys already know what I said. And I said, you could just ask students what they want. You don't have to put a GPS tracker on them. Like, you could ask people in the library. How are people using the library? You could engage with all kinds of people on the campus, faculty, resident advisors, people in the dorms and so forth, how people are doing. We don't have to track them. And then, I see these as just many sites of profit making out of our institutions, unfortunately. But I think that there's a lot, again, at stake, especially for students, when we don't think through more critically what we're doing. We also, of course, need to fund critical digital media research. If there's any program officers here and you want to talk about that, get with me. I'm going to be here for a minute. There's a lot of people in this room who I think care about this, but we don't really have big bodies of public funding available to look at these kinds of issues. Quite frankly, it's very difficult to do this type of research, those of us who do it, and we need more resources. I also think we need to be curating the indexable web, and I say this to librarians, archivists, information professionals. We need to have more public, democratic, institutionally supported pathways to knowledge. The front door can't just be a commercial search engine. And libraries, academic libraries in particular, are only available to people who have a university ID and access. So what we see is that, and I tell this to policymakers many times when I'm in DC talking about my work, I say, listen, it's insufficient to regulate big technology companies. I mean, of course we need that, but it's insufficient to just do that and simultaneously defund every important research organization, public research organization that's funding research, defunding public libraries, defunding higher education, defunding public education. So the democratic counterweights in terms of institutions where knowledge, and in fact, the MIT Tech Review article that I just shared with you a few minutes ago, one of the things the researchers say is that most of the big data lives in private commercial operations. So it's becoming increasingly more difficult for academics to do the research too, because it's harder and harder for us to get access. Ultimately, I think we should never give up. These things are daunting in some ways, but they are also things that we can work on together. And I really believe that our commitments to people and to the environment can eclipse the commitments to the tech. And so I'll leave it there and say thank you for letting me speak with you today.